For thousands of years, men have fought for supremacy on the high seas. They have been carried by fleets of warships into battles that determined the fate of nations and made heroes or villains of those who bore the burden of command. History suggests, however, that the outcome of battles at sea was often decided not by maritime or military skill, but by the weather. If howling winds, mountainous waves, and driving rains conspired to play their part in a battle on the oceans, the men aboard all ships faced a deadly enemy, and few were able to claim victory over a storm at sea.
For a practiced sailor, professional sailor, big storms is something which they take, which they expect in a funny way they enjoy. It's the part and parcel of the stories they can tell afterwards. And if they know that their boat is going to weather any storm, can turn upside down and will rewrite itself, they've got confidence, they needn't panic. For somebody in a boat which is liable not to take a storm over a certain duration and stress, it's one of the most frightening things in the world. Even nowadays, if you're in the wrong sort of boat in the wrong sort of waters when a cyclone comes along, it's very, very frightening.
The wooden sailing ships that dominated war at sea for the greater part of history may appear to modernize to have been more susceptible to raging storms than the iron steamships or huge turbine-powered battleships that replaced them in the 20th century. This, however, was not the case. During the Second World War, the sea and its storms proved that they could do whatever they liked with the most powerful and sophisticated ocean-going vessels man could build. On the 18th of December 1944, the Pacific Ocean belied its peaceful name with a typhoon that treated the United States Third Fleet as if it were little more than toy boats on a pond. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was there on board the newly built battleship, the 57,430-ton Missouri. No one who has not been through a typhoon can conceive of its fury. The 70-foot seas smash you, the rain blinds you. The battleship New Jersey was once hit by a 5-inch shell, and I didn't even feel the impact. The Missouri had kamikaze crash on her main deck and repaired the only damage with a paintbrush. But the typhoon tossed our enormous ship Missouri as if she were only a canoe. The experience of the Pacific Fleet in 1944 suggests little has changed from a time nearly 25 centuries earlier, when the Persians lost a quarter of their fleet to a violent storm during their second war with the city-states of Greece. It was in the summer of 480 BC that the Persian navy, some 1,500 warships and 3,000 transports, was shadowing their army as it marched along the coast into Thessaly. As night approached, the Persians anchored close inshore near Cape Sepias, intending to sail on next day. Some Persian vessels were able to find land moorings. The remaining ships were forced to ride at anchor further out to sea, lined up row upon row, 8 vessels deep.
If you've got a sufficiently weatherly ship and you have got the control over which way it's going to point in a storm, you are often far safer being out at sea than you are being inshore. If you are close to shore, especially close to a lee shore, to a shore that's downwind, the storm is pushing you towards this shore, then you're in danger not from the sea so much, but from the land. If the storm pushes you against the land, your ship can be pounded to flinders on the beach and everybody will be killed. In that environment, you are far safer out at sea than you are on land. But there are always storms that are strong enough to overcome any ship. No ship is safe.
In his histories, the Greek writer Herodotus described subsequent events. In this manner they passed the night. But at dawn of day, calm and stillness gave place to a raging sea and a violent storm, which fell upon them with a strong gale from the east. The ships which the storm caught out at sea were driven ashore, others on the beach itself, others again about Cape Sepias, while a portion were dashed to pieces. There was no resisting the tempest. Such as put the loss of the Persian fleet in this storm at the lowest say that 400 of their ships were destroyed, that a countless multitude of men were slain, and vast treasure engulfed. The storm lasted 3 days. The English Channel, an unpredictable arm of the Atlantic Ocean, has earned its fearsome reputation for bad weather. This narrow strip of water, only 112 miles across at its greatest extent, has probably done more to wreck the plans of invading armies than almost any waterway in the world.
The Channel receives the full force of the westerly winds, the westerly gales that create British weather. And the result is that it's a very unpredictable and a very dangerous strip of water. It's a major factor in the fact that Britain has not been invaded for such a long period of time. Difficulties, uncertainties affecting sailing ships particularly along that strip of water.
In the late summer of 55 BC, it claimed as its victim no less a man than Gaius Julius Caesar, one of the greatest military commanders the world has ever seen. Determined to add the mysterious Isle of Britain to his list of conquests, Caesar crossed the Channel with his legions, leaving his cavalry on the northern coast of Gaul with orders to link up later with the main army in Britain. They set sail aboard 18 ships some 4 days after Caesar departed for Britain. But then, the notorious Channel weather took a hand.
The Channel and the North Atlantic, which the Channel is just an arm of, is not the Mediterranean. It is deeper, it is exposed to completely different winds, and as a result, year after year, time after time, Mediterranean sailors come up and try to operate in the Channel with shallow draft, oared, fragile Mediterranean craft that might be just great in a Mediterranean storm, but in a Channel storm, they are useless.
Julius Caesar himself recorded the fate of the convoy in his book, Gallic Wars. The 18 ships which conveyed the cavalry set sail with a gentle gale. When, however, they were approaching Britain and were seen from the camp, so great a storm suddenly arose that none of them could maintain their course at sea, and some were taken back to the same port from which they had started. Others, to their great danger, were driven to the lower part of the island, nearer to the west, which, however, after having cast anchor as they were getting filled with water, put out to sea through necessity in a stormy night and made for the continent. It happened that night to be full moon, which usually occasions very high tides in that ocean, and that circumstance was unknown to our men. The storm in the Channel put an end to Caesar's invasion. With the destruction of the cavalry went all hope of success. The appalling weather moved to the mainland, and the constant rain sapped the morale of the Roman troops. The Britons harassed and harried them at every step, until eventually, unable to bring the Celtic warriors to battle, the legions slipped off the island and back to Gaul. During the long years known as the Dark Ages, the north and eastern coasts of Britain were prey to constant brutal and bloody seaborne attacks from the Vikings. Most of these attacks were made without warning, and the Anglo-Saxon population lived in dread and fear of the sight of Viking longships on the distant horizon. While Anglo-Saxon warriors fought in savage battles to repel the Viking invaders once they had arrived on shore, it was the unpredictable moods of the North Sea that offered them the most protection. But the Viking longship, impressive enough to strike fear into the heart of the steeliest warrior when it sailed on calm waters, was also designed to withstand rough seas.
Norse ships of the sort used by the Vikings were clinker built, and that meant that the timbers on the sides of the hull were very long, thin timbers that stretched from stem to stern. It's the same plank all along the ship. That means that you have got all the flexibility of the original tree in your ship. The planks were cut radially from a tree trunk, and that means that the lengthwise strength and flexibility of the original tree is transplanted directly to the clinker-built craft. That means that the entire ship can flex and spring back, just as a tree in a storm can flex and spring back. It's a very strong way of building a vessel. And this meant that Norse ships, which had a comparatively shallow draft and almost no keel, and therefore would bounce about like a cork on the water, were able to survive bouncing about on the water because the ships were so tremendously flexible. Whereas a carvel-built vessel, in which shorter planks are nailed onto or screwed onto the strakes of the vessel, are far less flexible and far more likely to spring leaks in heavy weather.
With its short and narrow beam and one huge heavy sail, the longship was built with maneuverability in mind, and therefore depended on the skills of the 40 or so Viking warriors aboard, who doubled as oarsmen.
The weather was a great factor in the lives of the Vikings, as it is in the lives of all seagoing people. They also used the sun as their means of steering.
Far advanced in military and naval tactics as they were, heaving waves put an end to many a Viking incursion, giving some respite to long-suffering Anglo-Saxon Britain. In the 11th century, bad weather had its part to play in the Norman conquest of England, the most famous invasion in English history. In the year 1066, King Harold II maintained a tenuous hold on his kingdom. The king was faced with two enemies, both of whom threatened invasion. These were the Norseman Harold Hardrada, who was in league with the king's own disaffected brother Tostig, and the dashing Frenchman William, Duke of Normandy. Both had claims to the throne of England and were prepared to fight to win what they believed was theirs by right. For King Harold, the question was simple: which enemy would strike first, and where? Hearing reports of a huge invasion fleet assembled at Dives-sur-Mer, Harold reasoned that it was William who posed the most immediate threat, and so he took his own enormous fleet of 700 ships to the Isle of Wight in order to meet the challenge. William, though, was a canny and astute commander, and he knew full well that a hastily assembled fleet of that size would soon run out of supplies. Beyond that, he trusted to God and to Providence as he waited for the prevailing west wind that blew in the English Channel to abate.
This is the Middle Ages. People are not communicating by fax, traveling by car. The idea of waiting 2 weeks to do something is not a long wait. When you're used to waiting for the seasons and used to waiting for the cycle of the months and the years, waiting a couple of weeks for the tide is not a problem.
Sure enough, on the 8th of September 1066, lack of supplies forced the fleet to sail to London. But while the king travelled north on horseback, his ships met with sudden, appalling weather. Relying on oars rather than sails to propel them, the mountainous seas capsized many ships in the Anglo-Saxon fleet, an ominous portent of the disaster to come. On the other side of the Channel, however, the French invasion fleet also fell prey to the uncertain elements. William was determined to move his fleet from Dives-sur-Mer to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, away from the flood currents of the Seine and much nearer to the proposed landing site of Pevensey. This was also an area where southerly winds to aid the invasion were more likely. The Channel's westerly winds blow hard and long at that time of year, and despite an early start to take advantage of the low tide, the French fleet was soon battered by storms as it made its way along the coast to its destination. The 160-mile journey took 2 full days, and several ships were lost. Duke William ordered that the bodies of those killed should be buried at night, in order that morale would not be undermined throughout the remainder of the fleet. Although William would stand victorious on the field of Hastings within the month, what thoughts went through his head as he surveyed the damage among an invasion fleet that had not yet actually set off from its own country?
Winning the Battle of Hastings enabled William the Bastard to set up a very different system of economic and military management for the English state. So England changed a great deal because of the outcome of the Battle of Hastings.
The weather almost certainly played a major role in giving modern-day historians the best primary source for the navies of the Tudor and Elizabethan period.
The Mary Rose was built in 1509, or she was started in 1509, and probably engaged first in 1512 in the First War with France. She was built in Portsmouth at the specific request of Henry VIII, probably close to the earliest dry dock in the world, which was built in 1495, or certainly the oldest one in England, which is very close to where she can be seen now in her ship hall.
Weighing in at an enormous 700 tons, she was the pride of King Henry VIII's navy. And in 1545 she was part of the royal fleet, gathered at Portsmouth to repel an attempted invasion of the Isle of Wight by the French. By this time, the whole concept of naval warfare was changing. Until then, ships had merely conveyed armies to do battle on land. Now ships were expected to do battle at sea. This new type of warfare, of course, meant more men and more guns aboard ship. And this was another contributory factor in the tragic events of July the 19th. Little did the English suspect, as the day dawned, that their loss would be so great. The winds in the Solent whipped the waves into a swell that some have suggested took the waterline of the heavily laden ship above its lower gun ports, which were already open for battle. The deadly waters poured into the lower decks of the ship, and she heeled over, flooded, and sank.
The weather was the final factor in a chain of causes that led to the disaster. The Mary Rose is a classic case of a disaster which took place because several things happened one after the other. Heavier guns were put on board, and these were put on board higher up, and so the centre of gravity of the ship was affected. It was going out to battle, and it was carrying, as was normal in those days, a large complement of soldiers as well as sailors, because fighting took place by grappling and boarding a ship and physically taking possession of it. So you had several hundred, I think it was something like 800 soldiers, up on the top part of the deck, again lessening the stability of the ship. The third thing was that the gun ports at the lower level were left open, were kept open. Now, these gun ports are always slightly dangerous. It's always nice to have these guns low down, but because they are so close to the waterline, it's a fine matter of judgment whether you can actually use them or not. Probably through carelessness, they were left open. The final factor then was a change in the wind, which blew the ship around before the helmsman could change it. The result was that as it came round sharply, it bit deeply into the water on one side. Water started coming in on those gun ports, and as the water began coming in, the lack of stability higher up became evident. The heavier guns and the greater number of men up on the top deck meant that it heeled over more sharply. More water came in, and a point of equilibrium was lost, and the ship just kept on turning over and over.
King Henry, watching from Portsmouth docks, was able to hear the death screams of the panic-stricken English sailors. Only a handful of the crew of 500 survived. The remainder went to the bottom with the ship. Naturally, the French claimed she had been hit and sunk by their guns. But the fact is that the Mary Rose was out of firing distance. The tragedy seems to have occurred through a combination of pure misfortune and, of course, the unpredictable weather. The Mary Rose lay in the Solent for more than 400 years before she was raised in the early 1980s. To the delight and wonder of the nation, the ship revealed her amazing secrets, giving a spectacular insight into life aboard a Tudor sailing ship. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain, weary of his attempts to gain the throne of England through marriage with Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth, decided to send a great armada of ships to seize what diplomacy had for so long failed to deliver. It seemed that the entire mission was doomed from the outset. Under the reluctant command of the inexperienced Duke of Medina Sidonia, nearly 130 ships set sail from Lisbon to Corunna in the summer of 1588. And almost at once, the elements conspired against them. A huge storm wrecked many of the ships, and with little time for refits or repairs, the tone of the journey was set. It was not only the English fleet containing such experienced fighters as Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher that Sidonia would have to contend with. Sailing in a great crescent formation, the Spanish fleet tried desperately to draw the English ships towards them in order to board them. But the English had no intention of becoming involved in close-quarter action.
Spanish ships were built high. They had very high castles at the front and back of the ship. This is because the Spanish, again, were aiming to fight hand-to-hand, and being up high in a hand-to-hand fight was a big advantage. Because the English weren't going to fight hand-to-hand, they didn't need that advantage, so they built their ships low. They were interested in speed, they were interested in manoeuvrability, and they were interested in a long ship which could have a lot of guns along its flank. The Spanish approach, and the English fleet sails round them. This is very confusing for the Spanish because they obviously are aiming to sail up the channel and they expect the English to try and stop them. What the English are looking to do is close in and use their ship-smashing guns. Now, they have some problem with the Spanish formation, because if they try and attack the weakest ships of the Armada, which are inside the arrowhead, then they are in grave danger of being overwhelmed by the closing wings of the Crescent, in which case they would be involved in boarding, and they have no chance if the ships come close together, because the English ships don't have troops on them. They cannot fight hand to hand. So the English tactics very much are to attack the wings of the Crescent. They are looking to sail past a Spanish ship, firing their broadside, to turn, come back, sailing past, firing the broadside from the other side.
With both sides running short of ammunition, Sidonia decided to bring his Spanish fleet to anchor off Calais. It was to prove a disastrous decision.
The Spanish Armada is, of course, the classic case of the weather deciding a sea battle, because the English had engaged the Armada all up the Channel and had caused a good deal of damage to its ships, but had sunk not one of them. There had been considerable damage done, but the long guns didn't do any sinking. That night the English attacked the Spanish ships at the harbour in Calais with fire ships.
The Spanish are particularly worried about fire ships. There's been an incident in the fighting in Flanders where the Dutch send a ship loaded with explosives down towards a Spanish bridge. When the boat strikes the bridge, it explodes and hundreds of Spaniards are literally blown to pieces in the ensuing explosion. Seeing in the middle of the night blazing ships coming towards them, the Spanish panic. Nothing much happens to actually destroy any of the Spanish ships. In fact, all 8 of the fire ships harmlessly burn out on the shore. The damage is done by the Spanish ships colliding with each other in their panic. They're desperate to get out of the way, they're desperate to get out to sea.
And then the storms really hit them. It's the whole process of disintegration of command and ships being individually then overwhelmed by both natural disaster and by English fire.
All was now lost for the Spanish, but the worst was yet to come. The strong wind backed to west-southwest, driving Sidonia's fleet into the deep water of the North Sea. From there was little alternative for them but to sail westward and head for home around the British Isles.
The Spanish ships were built to do certain things, and one of them was not necessarily be able to navigate English waters in storms at that particular time of year.
The Armada is running north towards Scotland. They hold a council of war and they decide that when possible they will return to the Channel to renew the fight, but the weather won't let them. They end up north of Scotland and they decide that the only option is to head home, going entirely round the British Isles. This is going to be a hazardous voyage because they simply aren't supplied for it. The water has gone putrid, their food has gone putrid, they are very badly supplied. This is one reason why, as they head for home, many of the Armada ships are forced to try to land on the Irish coast. They're seeking water, they're seeking supplies. They have no charts of Scotland or Ireland at all. They have no idea what the Irish coast holds for them. It happens that the Irish coast is extremely treacherous and ship after ship is driven on the rocks. The crews, when they get ashore, are robbed by the Irish but otherwise not harmed. Ireland has a very small English garrison. They react with extreme brutality, and many of the Spanish survivors of the wrecks are murdered out of hand by the English garrison.
Only 67 Spanish vessels returned to see their homeland again. The weather paved the way for a terrible end for many brave men and fine ships.
The Armada was an extremely important part of English history, both because the invasion was prevented and also because it established the English as the #1 naval nation in Europe. They had proved themselves supreme in technology, in sailing ability. They had proved themselves the masters of Atlantic warfare. And Atlantic warfare was where the future lay.
More than 150 years after the debacle of the Spanish Armada, tempestuous seas came once more to change the course of British history. In 1744, a storm wrecked the French invasion fleet gathered to support the young pretender to the throne, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. The grandson of James II, the young prince had become the focus of the Jacobite cause and had pledged to win back the crown for the House of Stuart. But even this most optimistic of men knew that the objective could not be achieved without foreign help. So it was that a squadron with 15,000 French troops aboard set sail for Kent in early 1744. But they never arrived. Raging storms came to wreck the fleet, forcing Charles to postpone his attempt for a full 18 months. It was the darkest of omens for the entire Jacobite enterprise, which began brightly and with high hopes, but ended with the slaughter of the clans on Culloden Moor and the ruthless Highland clearances. This was not the first time the weather had intervened to hinder the Jacobite cause. By an eerie coincidence, a French fleet had also sailed in support of the rising in Scotland in 1715, and that too was torn apart by a tempest. The final years of the 18th century heralded the Age of Sail, which ushered in a new era of maritime combat. Huge vessels with many decks and many guns fought battles with names that echo down the years. The glorious 1st of June, the Nile, Copenhagen and Cape St. Vincent. Yet even with the enormous strides made in ship design and battle tactics, it was impossible to defeat the weather. During the Age of Sail, a ship was as hampered by lack of wind to fill the sails as too much wind to wreck them. Nothing can have been more frustrating for an admiral than to sight the enemy on the horizon, yet see his own ships becalmed, unable to move in and engage them. A situation like this faced England's greatest naval commander during history's most famous sea battle. Admiral Lord Nelson's momentous defeat of the combined French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar freed England from the threat of invasion by the Emperor Napoleon. Yet even Nelson's legendary self-confidence must have been dented as he faced his ships of the line towards the Allied fleet on that infamous October day in 1805, for there was hardly a breath of wind to carry the English towards their enemy.
With all the ships being powered by sail, wind was very important. And obviously it was important that both the fleets, both your oppositions and yourself, wanted to fight. Because if the wind wasn't right, or was right, and they didn't want to fight, they would just sail off into the distance. A lot of it depended on the sailing capabilities of the ships themselves. There were faster ships and there were slower ships, and Victory was known as a very good sailing ship. That was why she was chosen so many times by different admirals, because she was able to keep up with the fleet. It was no good with the admiral's flagship lagging behind. He had to be up there with the rest of them. And so with the majority of ships being second and third raters, which were smaller, more nimble ships. It was important that all the ships were able to keep up. If the weather conditions were too bad, it was obviously difficult to fight a conclusive battle. There could be small skirmishes, but nothing much more.
The British would move in on the French in two columns. One on the weather side, the windward side, and that would be under Lord Nelson. And the other would be on the leeward side, away from the wind, under Lord Collingwood. And they were going to run right into the French line of battle, so that on the left, Nelson hit the French line of battle dead center. Collingwood hit the French line of battle off on the right, and half of the French line would just keep on going, sailing away from the battle. So Nelson would cut the French fleet in half, and while half the fleet was trying to turn round and come back, which is very difficult to do in a sailing ship, Nelson and Collingwood would be beating up the rest of the French fleet and destroying it.
As the Victory, Nelson's flagship, made its painfully slow progress towards the ragged Allied line, it came under heavy fire from the French ships Redoutable and Bucentaure, fire that she was unable to return. It was impossible for a ship to return fire without having first broken the line of the enemy. A hazardous business at the best of times, but doubly dangerous when lack of wind dictated that the maneuver was carried out at a snail's pace. It was not until 1 p.m., some 90 minutes after he had hoisted his famous signal, that Nelson was able to break the line and rake the French ships, which he did with devastating effect.
The line was designed to maximize your firepower. If you could get your men of war in a continuous line, then they could have all their broadsides directed at you as you're coming towards them. Now, if you broke their line, not only do you disorganize their tactics and make command and control very, very difficult for enemy commanders, but it also allows you to rake them if you can pass down the stern of the enemy, which is really the weakest part of the ship. Then you simply rake up the entire length of the enemy battleship. And at its very best, raking would allow a comparatively small ship, for example, like a frigate under Cochrane, to take on a man of war.
If you fire against an enemy ship from the side, you might hit something important, you might not. Depends on whether there's something important in that bit of the ship. But if you're raking it, you're firing right through the stern of the ship, then you can hit anything on that ship. You can hit all three masts if you want, because everything is vulnerable from the stern. An entire enemy fleet can be put out of commission very rapidly if you can break their line.
With this, the English fleet was set on course for a historic victory. Although within half an hour, the architect of the triumph will be laying mortally wounded on the decks of the Victory. During the early years of World War II, the British Navy was faced with its sternest test of courage and endurance. It was required to organize and sail the convoys of ships that were sent across the Arctic Ocean with aid and supplies for Russia. In June 1941, Hitler sent his armies into Soviet Russia, and the Germans won a series of spectacular victories as they drove closer and closer to the beleaguered Soviet capital, Moscow. Stalin appealed to Britain for help. Russia desperately needed supplies of food, trucks, aircraft, and tanks. In order to reach Russia, however, the Arctic convoys had to sail across the wild seas of the most inhospitable ocean in the world. When winter came, the violent storms, almost constant darkness, and ever-present ice added to the miseries of British crews, already under threat from the menace of the German U-boats.
Norway was the area where many U-boats came from. They could get all around England, they could feed and refuel off Spain at the time, and therefore you had to get out of England and you had to sail through this invisible curtain And you didn't know whether there was 1 or 41 U-boats, but a U-boat pack was the main danger.
Conditions in the Arctic were appalling. The journeys, if made safely, were made in a numbing, unending nightmare of fog, ice, and blizzards. Fear of the elements was equal to the fear of enemy torpedoes, as men were forced to contemplate a horrible death from exposure or by drowning.
The guys who were on the Murmansk run, when convoys would leave the northeast coast of England and head up around that North Cape, that was murder. The icy conditions of January and February, let alone the other winter parts, if you got torpedoed up in the real North Atlantic around the North Cape, Spitsbergen, and there, if you went in the sea, you would last for 20 minutes, and that would be it. You would just freeze to death. So the guys who went up on that Murmansk run were real heroes. They just had a lot to put up with, and a lot, of course, didn't come back.
The stretch of water between Iceland and the Russian ports of Murmansk and Archangel was crossed by around 40 convoys containing 800 ships during World War II. 100 of these ships became victims of the German U-boats and the ferocious weather. The crews of the Atlantic convoys fared little better. When the weather turned here, ships were tossed and blown on sea swells and winds that sometimes reached 60 or 70 knots. All that could be done as the small ships tried to make headway was to hang on for dear life and pray. In 1944, unseasonable stormy weather in the Channel yet again threatened a major military operation. This time, Operation Overlord, the code name given to the Allied invasion of Europe in June of that year. Nearly 2 years in the planning, Overlord was given a target date of May 1944, and 5 beaches west of the River Orne near Caen in France were chosen as the landing area for the invasion. These beaches were given code names that loom large in military history: Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, and Utah. Great steps were taken to convince Hitler and his Western Front commander, Rundstedt, that the attack would be made in the Pas-de-Calais area to the north. And all preparations for the invasion seemed to be going smoothly, until the stormy weather of late May and early June. With no let-up in the storms, an indefinite postponement of the entire operation seemed likely, until the weather relented just enough to allow the Allied Air Force to play its vital role, and for the landings to be given an irrevocable launch date of June the 6th, 1944.
We finally went down to Portsmouth on HMS Van Pura, which was a landing craft carrier, and from there we started the assault on Normandy. And as you know, it didn't happen the days it should have done.
They put us on the boats a couple of days before, and then they postponed the landings. And we were rolling about on these landing craft for a couple of days before they decided to take off because of the weather.
But it was equally as bad the next day, so it didn't make any difference. But we had to go the next day because of the tides.
The number of ships in the Channel that day was absolutely phenomenal. Thousands and thousands. You know, the sea was black with ships, and the sky was black with aircraft as well. I was surprised they didn't have more accidents in the air than on the sea.
Utah and Omaha beach assaults were made from amphibious craft that pitched and rolled in the windswept surf, and that were dashed against German underwater obstacles. Many brave men met their end not by bullet or shell, but by being sucked beneath the huge waves. The 8th Regimental Combat Team of the 4th U.S. Division were shocked to land in France almost unopposed, only to find to their horror that the high winds had blown them a full 2,000 yards south of where they should have landed. They had come ashore on the wrong beach, well away from the main German defenses, but there was little that could be done. They simply linked up with the paratroopers inland and waited for the rest of the division to come ashore. A generation, and more, of course, has every reason to be grateful that despite their very best efforts, even the notorious English Channel storms could not deny the invading Allied armies as they gained a first precious toehold on the continent. Within a year, the German war was at an end, and Hitler was dead. And so the story continues. Mankind's genius for warfare remains undiminished as soldiers and politicians look to add outer space to their ever-expanding list of military theaters. One thing remains unchanged, of course. The craft that can fight at sea whatever the weather has not yet been built. The high seas remain unconquered, and history has proved time and again that man can only win a fight with the oceans if the oceans decide not to fight back.